A woman is born with all the eggs she will ever have, but it takes the menstrual cycle to develop those eggs into a form capable of being fertilized. Eggs develop in the ovaries, and as they develop, we get fluctuations in female sex hormones released from the ovaries. These hormones are estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. Why does this happen, and what do these hormones do? It's easiest to understand this with a visual cue, something we call the menstrual cycle graph. I'm going to walk you through this bit by bit as the cycle progresses. You'll notice two things. First, down here on the x-axis, you'll see that I've marked day 28 with a 0 as well. That's because this is a repeating cycle. That means that day 28 of one cycle is day 0 of the next. There's no gap in between. Second, just a word about that 28-day length. That's the average, but not all women adhere to that. Women who have longer or shorter cycle lengths have that variation here. In the first half of the cycle, the follicular phase. In a 28-day cycle, ovulation occurs around day 14. And that marks the boundary between the two menstrual cycle phases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. The luteal phase doesn't vary. So if a woman has longer cycles, ovulation occurs later than day 14. If shorter cycles, it's earlier. On the y-axis, there are a few different things that we'll track at the same time. They're all occurring at the same time, which is why we've put them here together. On the top, we have the gonadotrophic hormones, FSH and LH, follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These are released from the anterior pituitary in the brain, and the hormones affect the development of follicles in the ovarian cycle. Below these, we'll have the ovarian cycle, what happens in the ovaries as the eggs develop into follicles. And just below that, we have the levels of ovarian hormones. Estrogen, that's here in pink, progesterone, down here in the orange, and inhibin in blue, which get released as the follicles are developed. At the bottom, we see the stages of the uterine cycle, which shows how the uterus changes as the levels of ovarian hormones change, and specifically what happens to the uterine lining. The stages of the uterine cycle are menses, during which the endometrial lining is shed, the proliferative phase, during which a new lining grows, and the secretory phase, during which the uterus gets ready for the implantation of a fertilized egg, just in case. In pink, as I said, we have the estrogen, the blue is inhibin, and here this orange line is progesterone. So let's concentrate first on the follicular phase, which is the left side of this graph. On day 0, the anterior pituitary gland is releasing some FSH and some LH. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone, and it does just as its name implies. It stimulates the growth of follicles. As the follicles grow, the number of granulosa cells in the ovaries increases. Many follicles will begin to develop in each cycle, but only one, or occasionally two, will reach maturation. The granulosa cells are what releases estrogen. So as the number of cells increases, the amount of estrogen is going up and up. We also have LH, or luteinizing hormone, acting on the ovaries at the same time. LH causes the thecal cells that surround the follicle, that's these cells here in blue, to produce a hormone called androstenedione. This hormone is structurally very similar to estrogen, and the granulosa cells convert it to actual estrogen, so there's even more estrogen being released. If you look down at the uterine cycle, you can see that as the estrogen goes up, a new uterine lining has begun to grow. The estrogen is causing that. So far, everything's been pretty straightforward, but we're about to get more complicated. Remember that estrogen is being produced by the ovaries, but it's acting all over the body, and that includes not just the uterus, but also the brain. The high levels of estrogen act as negative feedback to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. As soon as they begin to sense that the levels of estrogen are high, they begin to release less FSH and LH. So see how they're dipping here when the estrogen gets high? Since the point of having lots of FSH and LH was to develop the follicles, and the follicles are now developed, we don't need such high levels of these hormones anymore. So that makes sense for the actions of estrogen, but don't forget that the ovaries release two other hormones and they start to kick into gear at this point. Progesterone is still kind of low at this point, but inhibin begins to increase just at this point when FSH and LH begin to surge. And there are actually two types of inhibin, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to lump them together here. The role of inhibin is to inhibit the release of FSH from the anterior pituitary. So as inhibin starts to increase, FSH in green here starts to decrease. At this point, when estrogen gets super high, there's actually a positive feedback effect of estrogen on the brain, just to make things more confusing. So suddenly the brain wants to release more FSH and LH. The brain tries hard to release both. But remember that we have inhibin in action, which prevents the release of FSH. Inhibin doesn't have any effect on LH, however, so when this happens, we see a high spike in LH, an event called the luteal surge. This luteal surge is what pushes the development of one follicle, or occasionally two, to its final step, the release of the egg in ovulation. Remember that in a standard 28-day cycle, that's happening at day 14. The follicles that don't release eggs then begin to recede to be used again in another cycle.